Again, welcome to the Commanded June webinar. It is my wonderful pleasure to have as our speaker for today, Donald Stevens. And I'm first going to tell you a little bit about Commanded, then I'm going to introduce Donald. So my name is Valerie Taylor, and I'm the CEO and president of Commanded. I'm also the director of the Mathematics and Computer Science Division at Argonne National Lab. So it's wonderful to have you here. Just want to note too, Commanded is the presenter of the Tapia Conference, which is upcoming September 10th through the 12th in Dallas, Texas. So we also look forward to seeing everyone in Dallas to have an opportunity for in-person interactions. But now let's turn our focus on to Donald Stevens, who is the head of AI for Chase Finance and Business Management. Prior to his role, he was head of modeling and artificial intelligence for Chase operations. And that is Donald provides executive leadership on driving AI strategy and execution. He also oversees a team of applied AI researchers dedicated to utilizing advanced machine learning and AI techniques to address business challenges. And that is prior to joining JPMorgan Chase, Donald spent 16 years at Moody's Corporation, where he worked across various research teams, including securitized products, credit portfolios, and infrastructure and project finance. Donald is also completing his doctorate in systems science and complex optimization at Binghamton University, and he holds a master's degrees in quantitative methods from Columbia University, applied mathematics from Johns Hopkins University, and pure mathematics from St. John's University. Woo, woo, impressive, impressive, Donald. So let's start off, and just to let everyone know, if you have questions, we will take a few questions throughout, but we are going to allow time for questions at the end. You're welcome to enter questions via chat or use raise hand. So I'll be looking for both. But let's start off talking about fintech. So you're now at JP Morgan. You previously were at Moody's, which is also a financial services company. So what attracted you in general to the area of fintech?
Sure. So first, let me just say thanks to you all, Commanded, for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to speak today and get to know the attendees. So my undergrad was in computer science and mathematics, and at the time, and I don't want to date myself too much, but we're really talking about the late '90s when I did my undergrad. I didn't have a great perspective on how degrees in computer science would get used in industry. I took the natural presumption that upon graduation, I would end up working at a technology company like a Microsoft or Oracle or something to that effect. Towards the end of my undergrad, I ended up doing an internship through a program called Inroads. If you're not familiar with Inroads, think of them as a professional development non-for-profit that's really focused on developing minorities for careers in corporate services, if you will, and private industry. And as part of that internship, I end up getting a full-time job with Moody's Corporation, which ultimately I then spent another 17 years at Moody's. So it was a productive internship, if you will. But in that internship, I was an intern in their risk management services department, which was an area that utilizes, or at the time utilized, mathematics and computational science to develop mathematical models to predict the behavior of certain financial assets. Um, and it was sort of the very first time I got to see the use of computer science outside of software programming, outside of systems engineering, those sort of things. And it was very exciting to me. So that's really my start in the fintech space. I forget when the term fintech started to get adopted. I want to say it was like mid 2000, but I could be wrong. But unfortunately, I just didn't really understand the true scope of what a degree can do for you, and that makes sense at the undergrad level. I think nowadays there's so many more resources to help understand those things early on. Um, but as part of this program, I got to see how we combine data with different forms of analytics. Some of those analytics are computational in nature, where you need a computer literally to carry these things out. And some of it is more analytical, where you have closed form solutions and those sort of things. And then also the explanation of how these things get built, right? Or what people in the industry call the utility of things,
Mm.
right? So, for example, a very common use of these approaches are to predict the weather, if you will. Uh,
Right.
right? But at the end of the day, people they just don't want to know if the weather was predicted right. They want to understand, like, hey, like, what assumptions did you make? What could I worry about in the future? What happens if you're wrong in your prediction? So I started to learn more about these things, and then I became even more excited. And that's what led to getting additional degrees that you mentioned in the introduction, which is thank you for that great introduction. So I spent a lot of my time then studying more computer science, more mathematics in both applied as well as pure mathematics. But effectively, that was my start.
Okay. So, this is out of curiosity. When you talk about risk management in terms of assets, can you give an example of a question that you were trying to address with the analytics?
Sure. So it's okay if you're not familiar with finance for those that's on the call, but in the market. So think of market as just money moving, if you will. It could be company to company, people to company, and so forth, country to country. You have this concept of the public side of the market, and that's effectively, if you ever watch news and you see the stock tickers, that's people investing in different companies. Those companies are public. You also have situations where there's companies that are private, and private just means there are no public stockholders that's investing in that entity. So they're getting financing through other ways. Um, the areas that we focused on in that internship and the years shortly following that was we're developing models that helped us understand the likelihood for a private entity to default. And the
Uh-huh.
reason why that's important is, and default basically just means it's similar to personal credit. It basically just means you're not going to meet your debt obligations. So if Valerie were to offer me or lend me $1,000 as a personal loan, if I could not repay all or a portion of that, that could be considered default. Companies follow the same sort of concept, if you will. The difference between public and private companies is that in the private company world, we just don't have as much information about those companies, right? So if you think about public companies, there's required disclosures of performance, right? So if you ever see a company do an annual earnings call or they file earnings or those sort of things, or if you just want to go online and Google certain aspects about the company, you can. In private entities, that information isn't always available. So there's a larger challenge to model the behavior of those sort of companies.
Okay. Thank you. My understanding about the risk management. Okay.
Mhm.
So now, too, so you spent time at Moody's,
Mhm.
and then what attracted you to JP Morgan Chase?
Sure. So I've only worked at three companies in my career, and my career is about 25 years at this point. I worked at Moody's for 17 years, but it wasn't 17 years continuously. 5 years into Moody's, I actually took a job offer at Morgan Stanley. So I left, went to Morgan Stanley, and
Okay.
returned back to Moody's 1 to 2 years later. And then in 2017, I moved to JP Morgan Chase. And I give that background, one, to just sort of emphasize I don't change companies often. Usually, when I change companies, it's because I want to get out maybe my comfort zone, or I want to learn something new, or tackle something a little bit different. what was really attractive on the JP Morgan Chase side of the fence was there's such a large company that I just knew that the problems they would look at would be a little bit more complex and a little bit larger in terms of data needs and computation needs and those sort of things, right? Moody's is a very large company. I think at the time, Moody's was on the order of maybe 10, 11,000 employees worldwide.
Okay.
Uh, at the time I joined Chase inside JP Morgan Chase, we were at 100,000 employees worldwide just on the Chase side of the fence. As of today, JP Morgan Chase is just at or over 317,000 people. So you can just imagine the sheer size and volume and the scope of some of these activities and projects.
Wow. So that's like a factor of 30 difference currently between Moody and JP Morgan Chase. So then I have to ask this question still related to JP Morgan. And
Mhm.
that is when how, like when you're in a position and you recognize that you want to go outside of your comfort zone and expand, how do you go about pursuing um, the directed opportunity? Did JP Morgan pursue you, or was it a combination of both?
That's a great question. So my initial contact with JP Morgan Chase was an executive recruiter at the firm reached out to me to inquire. Typically, the way these things will start out is if a recruiter reaches out to you, it typically starts out as an exploratory conversation. And an exploratory conversation effectively means there may not always be a role at the company that reaches out to you, right? And as you become more senior in your career, you'll find more of those conversations taking place. And the reason is if you ever go online, you may notice you don't find as many posted roles when it comes to managing directors and executive vice presidents and CEOs, right? And the reason is because those things are sort of done at the executive level, those things are sort of done not behind the scenes, not 100% behind the scenes, but they're done proactively over time, right? So you're thinking about those spots long before those spots actually open up as a company. So this started out where at Moody's at the time, I was what you would call a senior vice president, and Chase reached out where they wanted to grow um, their work in artificial intelligence. And at the time, again, my background was primarily mathematics, computer science, and finance. AI at the end of the day, underneath the hood, at the end of the day, most AI gets solved as optimization problems. Okay. And,
Mhm.
I won't go through, don't worry, I will not go into a math lesson here. I won't go through a computer science lesson. But really at the end of the day, and I say most AI, if I were to go back 8 years ago, I would have told you 90% of AI was optimization problems. Now
Mhm.
that number's a little bit smaller only because we have new areas of AI like reinforcement learning.
Right.
So, the technical definition of what optimization is, we sort of say, okay, about 75% of all AI problems is optimization. But the reality is that number could be slightly higher depending on how you define reinforcement learning. Um, but I say all that to say, at the end of the day, you really have two large buckets of things happening with AI, and it could be more. But one is what people call search, right? Search is I have lots of data at data points. And what you're really doing is you're searching through that space to get to some answer,
Right.
right? That's really what's happening, right? Computer science was a big component of solving search. So if you think about if, and I invite people on the call, if you're studying computer science or interested in computer science, you definitely want to make sure you're studying things like algorithms and data structures.
Mhm.
Those two courses, they're designed to really help understand things like searching and sorting in computer science. And that's why a lot of time AI gets associated with computer science in addition to mathematics, because computer science brings a wealth of searching and sorting approaches. And that's what a lot of computer scientists spend time on, thinking
Mhm.
of algorithmic ways to address searching and sorting. But if you ever think about making a decision as a person, you normally get a list of options. When I say list of options, that's what I mean by data or data points. And the options can get so complex that it looks like large volumes of these options.
Yes.
And the truth is, AI doesn't always know the answer because it doesn't have the domain knowledge. right? So again, I may be able to speak to someone on this call about finance or mathematics, but suppose it's a topic I've never seen before, I'm not intimate with. Suppose somebody wants to talk about, you know, astrophysics. I'm not an astrophysicist, right? So I don't know much about it. Now the mathematical principles may carry over, but I'm not a subject expert in astrophysics. That's how you have to kind of think of AI in many cases. It's not always an expert in a very particular domain. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So because of that, you need a way of telling the AI how to get closer to the answer. And it does that usually by two things. One is searching, the other one is looking for patterns or pattern recognition. When you combine these two things, you get at the heart of what we later call AI. And when you hear about things like ML, like machine learning and deep learning or Gen AI, those are just different ways of doing that, those two things, like the searching and the sorting and the um, what's the other term? Sorry, searching, sorting, and pattern recognition. Sorry. Um, so that's really what AI is really doing in that aspect. So Chase at the time was interested in growing their use of AI in the financial services space. So given my background in computer science, mathematics, and finance, it was sort of a nice blend.
Okay, nice. So this, you know, leads very well to the next question about what are some of the challenges that you're addressing in terms of your current role of leading the AI at JPMorgan Chase. So I can think of some things, but sometimes when I think about AI and fintechs, you often think about investments. Uh,
Mhm.
but I know there's a lot more and broader scope. So I understand the astrophysics and the high energy physics and not so much the financial. So I welcome learning more about what are the type of problems that you're addressing. Um,
Sure.
yes.
Yeah, so to take a step back, you've heard me go back and forth in using the term Chase and JP Morgan Chase to explain why I did that and why I do that. JP Morgan Chase itself as a corporation is quite large. And within that corporation, you may actually have different companies or different business lines.
Hmm.
So I work in what you all will call the Chase division of JP Morgan Chase. We have more than one division. One division focuses on what you could think of as investment banking. So have you ever heard
Okay.
of companies like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank historically? Actually, Goldman, I should say, is probably more wealth management, but there could be some investment banking there as well. But yeah, you do have a division that's focused on investment banking. We also have areas like private bank. I won't go through all of them if you're not familiar with finance, but I say all that to say there's different types of finance that exist. And
Okay.
Chase is what we call the banking side of it, right? Literally checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards, car loans, house loans. That's really the banking arena of it. You also have like investments, stock and those sort of things, securitizations, and different areas of finance focused on different partitions of that space, if you will. So I'll mention a little bit about what JP Morgan Chase would think about in this space, and then I'll mention a little bit about what Chase specifically would look like in the space. And I'll try to give a nice spectrum just so you get a sense of the potpourri of different problems to think about. So you can see the applicability of analytics and AI across the spectrum and not just not one vertical in that whole area.
Right.
So you mentioned investment banking, right? So if you think about investment banking, or investments, I should say, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to determine how to take some money today, put it someplace, not touch it, and allow that money to grow. Right?
Right.
That's effectively what investment is, right? So even if you put your money in a bank account, it's a form of an investment, right? Because the a savings account will pay for you having that money in that account, but the payment is very small.
That's it. Yes.
It's very small. In fact, if you even consider it to be present, it's right. Some people just call it zero as a joke, but it's really small. And the reason for that size is really, what we think about as risk, right? Typically, things will things generally speaking would have a higher return when the risk is higher, right? So if
Okay.
you ever think about taking out a loan, if you have lower credit, if you will, then obviously the cost of getting that loan is going to be a little bit higher because someone's taking on more risk. If you have
Right.
higher credit, then maybe, and when I say cost, I'm talking about things like interest rate, if you will. The rate may be higher, may be lower, the terms may be different. Um, and that's really what's happening in the investments. Investments are really designed to say, I take something today and I want to grow it over time. And that growth really depends on lots of different factors. And in the investment space, there's lots of different investment options, but let's say you want to invest in a company. If you want to invest in a company, if you will, like a form of a stock, if you will, or even a bond, you're putting some money here today, and then you don't touch it. And then what you expect to happen is the value of that is going to grow over time, right? And the longer it sits there, the more you hope it grows.
Mhm.
The reality is it doesn't go straight up, it goes up and down.
Yes.
And then what you're hoping is over time, you know, the cumulative effect of that is much better later than it was when you first started, right? So that's just sort of a quick 101 in, banking and investment, right? That's typically how that world works and why people put money into that space. So one thing you want to do when you think about AI is we've always had ways of using analytics to predict how we think something's going to happen in the future, right? So right now, let's pick something very basic. If you wanted to leave your house right now or your school or wherever you're located, you want to go outside, you may actually just peek out the window and look up to see if it's cloudy, to see if it's sunny,
Hmm.
right? Or you may just pull up the weather app and look at what's on the weather app. But the point is, what you're really doing is you're looking for a signal to tell you what could happen next. Now, that signal, if I look outside the window, see if it's cloudy, even if it doesn't rain, I may say to myself, wait a minute, there's a possibility it can rain, depending on where you're located. Or maybe if you're in the east, maybe it's going to snow. Who knows? But the point is, you need a signal. What the analytics does is it looks for signals to help put these things together to determine what could happen in the future. And could is probabilistically. So it's trying to predict what could happen based on the signals you have access to. So what we want to be able to do is predict the behavior of things like the market. Will interest rates go up? Will unemployment rates go down? You want to be able to predict the behavior of a credit asset. So if I if I were a bank and I loaned, Daniel some money, I want to be able to predict based on Daniel's spending patterns, is he going to meet his debt obligation? Is he going to pay me back?
Hmm.
Right? And then what I did was I gave sort of a view of how would you think about modeling for like the investment side? How would you think about doing it for an individual person or individual account? But at the end of the day, what AI does is AI is still math behind it at the end of the scenes. But what AI does is it also gives us a way of searching larger volumes of data for more signals or more patterns, as I mentioned before, or more direction in sort of pointing us in the right insight in this large sea of data. So to give some other examples, so one is investments where if I really want to grow my money by X%, what would be a good investment? And then thinking about that investment over time. So you're predicting the behavior of the investment at different points in time. Or the market. I really want to understand what would the interest rate look like in 2 quarters from now, trying to predict that out.
Right.
Or it could be something as simple as, I should say simple, I use that relatively, but it could also be, where do we put the next Chase branch? Do I build a branch in this state, in this particular neighborhood, or do I build a branch in this location? And what you find is that AI, analytics, machine learning, they all combine as tools in this whole predictive analytics space.
Okay, okay. That's very helpful. And so here, if you could talk about too, and that is, what are some of the current innovations in AI that you particularly, use? You mentioned this, the search, the sort, and pattern recognition. And I have to say, a lot of, I also work, with applied math. So the optimization becomes, a fundamental concept of driving AI. But what do you see as some of the innovations in AI that's driving or that you're utilizing a great deal in the fintech space?
Sure. So for those that may not have understood exactly what I mean by the specifics of optimization, I know Valerie is in a scientific space, so she understands that really well. But let me sort of maybe take 30 seconds to help you all understand what I mean when I say optimization. So right now, if I ask anyone from the audience, if I give you a question like 2 plus X equals 5, something very simple. You could do this off the top of your head. You wouldn't even need a calculator. That question is too easy for any of you, right? So, and then you would say, well, maybe what I would do is I would subtract 2 from both sides, and then X would be 3. And then I would check it. 2 plus 3 equals 5, right? And that's a good way of doing it. Now, in the optimization sense, what you would do is you would assume I have 2 plus X equals 5. What I would do is I would want to try different values of X and keep plugging it in and then see if whatever number I get, so I try X equals 1, or 2 plus 1 is 3. I do X equals 2, 2 plus 2 is 4. You get the idea. I want to keep trying different values of X, and then to know if I'm getting closer, what I'm trying to do as an optimization problem is I'm subtracting the different numbers that I try from 5. And what I'm really doing is I'm trying to minimize that distance. I'm trying to say, I don't know how to, basically you take a step back and say, I don't know how to do addition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just try different versions of X. And then every time I try a different version of X, I'm going to subtract the X plus 2 from 5 and just see if that number is getting smaller. If the number is getting smaller, that means I'm getting closer and closer to 5. That's what I mean by search and optimization. If that number is getting bigger, that means I'm getting further and further away from the right answer. And that's how we tell systems like AI in many cases, in at least supervised learning of AI, that's how we tell it to go towards the right answer or the best answer. We have a sense of what the answer looks like. We just don't know the exact answer. And what we're trying to do is tell the computer how to get closer and closer to the right answer. So you're really just subtracting. And if I'm right, 5 minus 5 should be 0. And 5
Mhm.
minus 5 equals 0 means I hit the right X. That's effectively what that means. Now, I believe the specific question was, well, what are some projects we do on it, right? So I gave you the background on why optimization becomes important in artificial intelligence, but let me talk about some specific cases. Um, Now, there are different areas of AI. It's a huge field. There are researchers dedicated to each area. Each area is huge. I mentioned reinforcement learning. That was a pivotal, research area in AI. Nowadays, lots of focus on generative AI.
Mhm.
So if you ever use, I hate to use any specific names, but if you ever use like OpenAI, ChatGPT, there's so many large language models nowadays. Generative AI is huge in this space. So if you speak to not only myself, but a lot of practitioners, you're always going to hear someone mention something in the Gen AI space. That's commonplace these days. One thing that we found is that we can use generative AI to really help us understand our own knowledge bases. So what I mean by a knowledge base, for those that have ever tried to get data out of a database, right? What would you have to do? You have to, well, one, assuming that you had access to the database, you may be required to know something like SQL. You go take SQL. If you're not familiar with SQL, it's a sort of a language that helps you search databases. It's almost like you almost have to know a little bit about programming, but not to that extent. You run the SQL, you have to know a little bit about the database, and it searches for information and it brings that information back. But the caveat there was you really needed to know a little bit about SQL. You needed to know a little bit about the database. There are other types of databases that are just for files, right? You ever tried to search for a file on your computer? What you do, you try to put in a file name and you hope your computer can search all your directories and pull it back. Well, anytime you have a collection of data, that is not that different from a knowledge base. And as data grows, we end up having more unstructured data. Unstructured data is data that's really sitting like a paragraph in a file, or like a PDF or a Word document, or even a PowerPoint. And it doesn't really have true structure. It doesn't have like a header, it doesn't have a body. If I looked inside the file itself, I may not even know if it's a letter. I may not know who sent the letter. I have to search for that in the document. So you really get this sort of unstructured data. And if I want to store things like policies, I want to store things like procedures, they're going to sit in the articles. They're going to sit in documents. And then the searching for those are so much harder. So what we found is that we can use, namely things like large language models, where we can ask a question in just plain natural language. The same way I'm talking to you all today on the call, I can literally type that question, put it into the system, and the system will literally search through all those files and bring me back either the files or the content related to my question. Now, prior to Gen AI, there's always been a way of doing that, but these ways have been maturing over time. So let me give you an example. If I wanted to search for the word house in Google, right? Google may
Mhm.
do something a little different.
Yeah.
What we're hoping is that it will have a database of information and searching for the word house. But suppose that Valerie, who's probably much more articulated than Donald, doesn't use the word house, use the word home. Well, then if I put the word house in, it won't bring back the documents because the word house wasn't there.
Hmm.
So what you want for these systems to do is understand that maybe house and home, they're really the same, they mean the same thing, but they could be two different words. And because of that, we found that generative AI, like large language models, have the ability to better understand that context than compared to the approaches that we've had in the past. And now it's not just searching for the word house, it's actually looking for other phrasing, even if it's more than one word, that matches that context, and it brings back much richer information. So one thing that we're doing internally is we're enriching all of our knowledge management systems, all of our databases, if you will, so that we can offer a better search mechanism. Have you ever tried searching for something online and you just can't get the information you want? Like
I
you
know.
have to play with the way you search. Well, Gen AI sort of helps fill that gap in that space. Outside of just knowledge bases, what we also find is insight generation. So insight generation basically means I define insight in three different ways. I'll tell you one of them today. Um, if you want to know more, maybe you can send out information afterwards, right? Because I think we're planning to send some stuff out to you all. But insight for me is really any information that helps me make my next decision. In
Hmm.
short, that's what insight is, right? And one way of giving me insight is telling me something that I didn't know that I didn't know. That's truly the benefit of insight, right? If you tell me something I already knew, it's not that it's not helpful, but I kind of knew it already. So it's probably not going to alter my decision much. But you may have told me something I never even conceived of, I never even thought of. And that is really that's what really drives insight and is going to cause me as a business person or even a company to make the next decision. What we found was earlier you heard me mention AI is great at pattern matching or pattern recognition. We found that we can use AI to go and search for patterns that we probably wouldn't even conceived of or even thought about. But patterns that could be so complex is not obvious, right? Otherwise, I would know to go search for it. But in this case, I may not know. So AI, we're also using AI to help us just understand um, our data. Now, that doesn't mean we always react or act on the pattern, because as you heard me mention earlier, AI doesn't have domain knowledge.
Right.
So we may use it to pull back insights, but then we look at those insights through a lens, through our domain knowledge to verify, is that insight practical? So let me give you an example. If I want to give all of you money, okay, I won't, unfortunately, but let's say I did.
We
If
would
I
love.
collect, right? If I collected information from all of you, um, and I knew your credit score, right? Yeah, like your FICO score. If I collected information from all of you, and not only you, but people like you, if you will, AI may be able to find a pattern, and I'm going to make this up, but it could be realistic. It may find a pattern that all of you with good credit happen to wear shoes,
Okay.
right? Because they're searching for patterns. That
Right.
could be a pattern now from a business sense, that pattern doesn't sound like it makes sense. But just from data, that's a really interesting pattern, right? Now, again, finding a pattern doesn't mean it's the reason. It doesn't mean it's causing behavior, right? So just because people happen to wear shoes doesn't mean wearing shoes makes you have good credit. It does not mean that. And there's special terms and analytics that help distinguish between those things. We're not going to go to that on this call, but I did mention that to say AI will pull back insights and it's very, very helpful. It does not mean all insights are correct, and it does not mean all insights should be actioned upon. But we find that it can help us do insight exploration in a much more convenient manner than a lot of the traditional methods, which usually a lot of those require you to have some sense of what you're looking for, right? So if you need to search for a needle in a haystack, well, you need to know the needle's in the haystack. But imagine you didn't know where the needle was, but you still need to search the haystack. That's what we find is that AI can offer some of those capabilities. And then we have the traditional sort of, predicting or trying to understand changes in the economy, what we call sensitivity analysis, trying to understand, well, what would happen in, the volume of loans if rates went up? What would happen if unemployment went up, unfortunately? So doing more, that's insight generation as well, but we call that more scenario analysis.
Okay, okay. And I could see just as you were talking about that, and you started off talking about, for example, risk with private companies.
Mhm.
And I can see, how that starts to relate, that you start to look at different scenarios and say, what if unemployment went up and this company is looking at these products, what impact would that have? And yeah, okay. So it's
Mhm.
starting to come together.
That's
So
right. I can
yeah,
give you a non-finance example if you just want to think about it. If you think about the common cold, there's no cure for the common cold. And you know why? There's millions, if not larger, number of strains.
that's it.
Just a lot of strains. Well, you know what you can do? Well, you can run AI and other advanced searches on all the data of people having colds, and then it can find patterns of what happens to be true across people who have colds. Maybe high body temperature, maybe low immune system, maybe certain genes. Who knows? Same thing in like cancer and those other areas. The point is that the data could be so complex, the patterns could be so complex, and it's not obvious. But I also wanted to give people a non-finance example. What you often find is the math doesn't really change between these things, right? But the data does change.
Okay, interesting. So then I'll ask one more question because I see some questions coming up in the chat, but I want to get to this one, and that is, what skills or experiences helped you transition into your current leadership role? Because
Sure. Mhm.
yes, especially, you're in the finance area, but had you taken finance classes um, as an undergrad, or just was wondering about that too?
That's a great question. So in my undergrad, I actually did not take any finance courses, right? So earlier I was indicating, well, I just took the presumption that I would end up working at a technology company, right? Because I really didn't understand the true scope and usage of computer science and software programming at the time. That's why internships become really important, because they help show you what's in the world, if you will. Conversations like these become important because you get to see the usage you wouldn't even conceived of. Um, but when I started working, the very first problem I had was I had no domain knowledge or context. I knew nothing about finance. In fact, because I was an undergrad, I didn't even have debt myself. Debt would be credit card. I didn't even have a credit card, right?
Okay.
I didn't have loans, right? Which is good, by the way, but I didn't have those. So I couldn't have an appreciation for them. So what I did was I spent those first 5 years of my career learning about finance. I had to learn on the job. Now, the positive point of that story is I was able to learn about finance without needing to know finance. I guess maybe the negative portion of that story was I probably needed better guidance to understand, hey, maybe it's good to take a finance class while I was in my undergrad, right?
Mm,
Because the truth is, even if I'd never gone into finance, taking a finance class would have been helpful because of my personal finances.
right.
So, it would have been a little bit helpful to do that. But we did, I don't know, Valerie, if you can share the screen. What we did is I do a lot of speaking engagements for JPMorgan Chase, and I do spend a lot of time speaking to students. I typically get this question of, well, Donald, what do people like you and your peers, what do you look for? What do you hire for? So in part to answer Valerie's question, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you two sides. there's this technical aspect side and there's the non-technical. The non-technical, I find it to be more difficult for people at times. And let me tell you what that is quickly. In the non-technical sense, if I walked up to you and I said, you have inflammation in your vascular tissue, right? Now that may mean nothing to you. And
Mhm.
then you're gonna give me this bewildered look and saying, what the heck does that mean? And then I'm gonna say, oh, you have a headache. And then you're gonna say to me, well, why didn't you just tell me you had a headache?
Yes.
Right? And the reason why I
Right.
give that example is because some of this information could be so technical that one of the most important aspects of the work that we do or anyone in this space, whether it be data science, mathematician, physicist, anything to that doctor, anything, is you have to be able to communicate your information and insights to an audience that may not have that background, right?
Okay.
Just like the weather people, they're using the same math I described earlier to predict the weather. But I don't, when I'm sitting on TV, I don't want them telling me about changes in distributions and flows and atmospheric pressure because I wouldn't even know what that means. I want to know, do I need to put a jacket on? Do I need to wear shorts? Do I need to bring a water bottle? So they need to communicate in a way where they can tell me a story in a way that I can consume it. So communication and storytelling are very, very important. And that's true in any role, by the way, but it comes even more important in roles where it's very technical in nature. Okay. So that's the non-technical side, and there's more. But on the technical side, I also like to show people this because this is the area that you can directly control. The communication, it takes practice. That is going to be something you're going to work on for time. And the audience will keep changing. So you'll always keep working on it. But on the technical side, you can actually go out and start to prepare for some of these things. Now, not all roles in artificial intelligence has to be analytical, but I'll go through this pretty quickly for those that's interested in the technical side. I think of data science as a hodgepodge and mixture of all these elements on the screen. There's really five that I carve out. Not in any order, but starting at the top, mathematical modeling. And I did put plain English descriptions of these at the top. But mathematical modeling, think of that as just being able to describe the behavior of something. That's really what I mean. So if every year I get older, then I just add one to my last year's age. That's a mathematical model. It's basic, but it's true. Optimization, I went through optimization earlier on this call, so I won't talk about that again, but optimization becomes important. Machine learning, I mentioned the importance of how machine learning, AI, deep learning, Gen AI, they all help in things like search and sorting and actually mainly search and pattern recognition. But there's an element of sorting as well and ranking. But really what you're doing for machine learning is and AI, you're asking the computer to help you with volumes of data and information that would be really difficult for you to keep up with. So think of it as almost an assistant to what you're doing by hand. Computer science is similar in the concept where you're asking the computer for assistance, but you're giving it explicit instructions. So if I wanted to calculate the product of 10 numbers, I'm telling it how to do that. And we normally do that through software or some software language. And the last one is statistics.
Mhm.
This is usually the thing that scares people when I mention this. I don't mean becoming a statistician. All I'm really referring to is the collection and understanding of data. That's really what statistics does at the end of the day. It teaches you how to collect data, how to distinguish between coincidence and causal behavior in data. It teaches you how to describe that data to other people. But it basically teaches you to be honest about your observations. Just don't get caught up in what you see, but actually try to understand what you see so you can make the next best insight and decision. So I think we're going to try to get a copy of this to everyone. I came up with this. There are others online that may have a different perspective or even a better perspective. But I'll stop here so we can get to some questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you. That was great. And so I do see some questions in the audience, and that is, I think, Guinevere, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, that's fine. I'm actually getting my master's in computer science currently at the University of Southern Mississippi. And I just had some questions because I noticed that you were talking a lot about AI and I mean, obviously it's like this big cultural aspect and everything. Like we're just like a huge shift in like how people are like considering like large data models and like entire industries are being built up all around this and everything. And I just have a lot of questions around it just because there are just so many things that like I just simply don't know about it. Like here, I'll go with some of the questions just in order from the chat. But do you think that part of the reason AI has become so popular is due to just the massive amounts of data that currently exist now? Because there's data points for like literally everything nowadays. And is it just kind of like a natural evolution of using computers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So basically, to replay the question back is, what are some things that led to the popularity of AI? There
Mhm.
are lots of different answers, to be very frank. There's no one thing. Um, in terms of history, the jump off point for what we consider to be modern day AI research, because AI has been around since any of us on this call was born, to be very frank. AI
Hmm.
is very old, okay? Now, there's been more investment in AI at different points in time, but in the early 2000s, there was something called the big data movement. What the big data movement did is it started this concept of massive databases that store data, and because they were massive, you can actually run computations on that data. And then from there, that was almost like a launch pad to more investment in AI. And the reason is because all the things we did for the 50 years prior to that, it was on smaller data sets, it was very manual, and now we had the ability to run an analysis on larger amounts of data. And then that kicked off that big data movement, rejuvenated the AI sort of research moment. That's why you're seeing advances so quickly now, because we can store large amounts of data. We don't have to wait months and years for that to happen. But some of the other elements of, well, why is AI still really interesting is because one, we are seeing areas where it provides benefit to traditional approaches. And what I mean by benefit is, if you think about the natural language for like ChatGPT and those sort of things, the traditional approaches, they were okay, but they weren't as sophisticated and helpful as today. So what we find is that there's an increased benefit on some of the classical things that we did in the past. But another area, to be very frank, is there's also such things as hype, right? Where the people are more excited about what they think the prospect of AI is than versus the actual prospect that they see. So it's a combination of those, right? If you don't know anything about AI, and I just went and started telling you all these good things that I didn't mention the other side of the fence, you would just think just the world, right? It's like great marketing, and then you would get really excited and enthused, and that could also lead to increased interest. That's why I think it's really important to be transparent about the positives as well as the watch items and the potential pitfalls. And I noticed in your question you mentioned bias, but there's a couple. I say all that to say there's a couple different reasons why it's beneficial, or why there's a lot of interest behind it. That interest I don't see dying out, if you will. I think it just takes different forms, if you will, over time. I think right now what we're seeing is a major culture shift in how people interact with AI. In the past, most of the AI you would have interacted with, it either would have been you're a computer scientist or a mathematician or somebody technical and you know how to talk to the AI like through some software. What's different these days is now you can know nothing about technology and you can interact with AI. And that's the big shift. So that's another thing that led to a lot of the excitement, because now people can literally play with it. They can get used to it. They can see it. They can ask a question, doesn't seem right, ask another question. And you don't need to know how to program to do that. So that's another element of that. Now, I know you did ask about bias. What I did want to do is I'll quickly answer that, but I also want to give some opportunity for some other people to raise some questions. So in the bias aspect, I'll tell you what my personal position is. Okay. Um, and to do that, I'll first tell you and unfortunately, we're not gonna have time for this, but I would have normally asked this group to tell me how do you define bias. That's what I would have normally asked. But we're not gonna have time for this on this call. So what I will do is I'll tell you bias is a very confusing concept for people because people think of bad things. If you were a child and you burn your hand on a lighter, right? Let's say you're 4 years old. Not that you should have a lighter, but let's say for some reason you touch the lighter, you burned your hand. Or you're rubbing your hand on some wood and you get a splinter. You're going to feel pain. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to rub my hand on wood anymore and get a splinter. I'm not going to play with a lighter and burn my hand. The truth is, what you just did is that's actually bias too, right? What bias really is at the end of the day, it's where you're making a predefined decision about how you want to treat something in the future. That's really what bias really is, predefined decision, right? When we are normally talking about bias in data, we're really referring to not the definition of bias, but the outcome of a decision, where you make a predefined decision and the outcome is based on dimensions we would not want to have happen, like your gender or your race, or if they're not even based on those things, the people that get impacted by it happen to fall in a certain group or classification, right, or category. That's really what people mean when they think about bias. So I separate the two to say, it's very hard to remove bias in terms of influence of decisions from data and from what we do because we use human data and human behavior in AI. And we ourselves have bias in our lives. We have bias in our decisions. So bias alone, it's very hard to distinguish from that. So we have to spend more time understanding that and looking for it inside the AI. But you also need to be very careful to be mindful of the impact of decisions. And that's another sort of way people are thinking about bias.
Yeah.
It's a lot bigger than that. I won't have time to go through the full thing. I'm sorry, Valerie, you started to say something?
Yes, I did want to give, there's a question in here from Ruben as well. So I wanted to give Ruben a chance to ask the question. If you want to unmute Ruben. Is
Yeah, so
okay.
hello. I did ask because you mentioned earlier that you use machine learning to predict market and investments. So when you train your models and there's a new policy, let's say for NVIDIA that like doesn't give you as many dividends or and you already trained your loss function on that, how are you changing that after? Like once they make new policies and once government's making their own that affects that company? That was kind of
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah, so remember I work on the Chase side of it, which is the banking side, not the investment side. So I was giving an example of how JPMorgan Chase can use AI. So I can't speak specifically about the investment side,
Well,
but
I mean, I guess that's same for like the market because you guys do have your own kind of
yeah, so
way that you handle it. Yeah.
that's how I'm going to answer. Yeah, that's how I'm going to answer that question. I just want to give some clarification there. So the question you're asking is fundamental to all models, and I think that's the point you're about to get to. The idea is this: you build a model, and models can either get used in real time or they can get used in a batch process. A batch process means you run it today, but sort of the information gets carried out over time. Real time means you get an output and you use it right there on the spot. That's really the difference between real time and batch. We have a very sort of structured at work. We have a really structured model consideration process. And what I mean by that is we have a process that tries to understand what data you use developing a model, what sort of assumptions you made when that model was being developed, what sort of outputs and observations are you seeing with that? And it's really detailed, really diced up. And what I mean by diced up is we don't look at a number alone to determine if a model is effective or not. It's not, it's actually much smaller than that. When people are learning, and I think it was Guinevere, if I got the last name correctly, she mentioned computer science. If someone's learning ML and AI in school, unfortunately, what happens is they get toward success metrics, things like accuracy, things like recall, precision. And I hate to say the word unfortunate, but I say unfortunate because that is not enough of the story. The reality is there is no one number that you can just look at for a model or something to say, oh, it's always working, it's never working. The reality is you have to look at the context of how it's being used. So what we do is we have this process that first is the independent process. So if I build a model, this review that I'm describing, looking at the data, the assumptions, and the results of the model, it gets done by someone independent of myself and my team. And the reason is because you need a fresh pair of eyes. You need someone that sort of doesn't have true skin in the game, if you will, someone that can look at it in a very sort of independent manner to give an independent assessment of the quality of it. Then we have another team that's focused on what we call disparate impact and disparate treatment. There, and that's what I was saying for the last question, they're really looking at the result of how we would use it. So who is it impacting? How is it impacting them? Those results aren't always the quantitative validation results of the model, but there's something a little bit bigger than that. They really go into what's called the utility of the model. Then once a model is in place, we have constant monitoring on it, and we're monitoring on different dimensions. One of those dimensions is disparate impact or bias in some cases, but other dimensions are, um, okay, processing time, a distribution of the outputs to make sure they're not, either they're in the right sort of area, they're in the wrong sort of area. Data drift. Sometimes data elements change over time. So years ago, interest rates went down to zero, which doesn't always happen in finance. That's a much different behavior than if interest rates were much higher. Recently, interest rates went up. It went up significantly higher in recent years than it would have done the prior 5 years, if you will. So we have to look at things like data drift. And what we do is we always try to understand the cost of, I don't want to say the cost of being wrong, but the cost of a number. So let me give you an example. If I were to tell you that a model, I'll make this up, is right 95% of the time, just a random model I picked, made up the top of my head 95% of the time in terms of accuracy. And generally, we wouldn't use accuracy, but let's just for the sake of argument say accuracy. If I were to ask you, is that good or bad, right? And we won't be able to play out the full exercise because we're short on time, but normally what I tell people is you cannot look at that 95 and tell me if it's good or bad. You cannot do that. You can have a sense of that, but you can't tell me that. The way for me to know 95 is good or bad is you have to tell me what's happening with the 5% or the cost of the 1% in that 5. So for example, suppose that 5% was that 30 million customers will lose their investment. Well, I'm sorry, will lose their retirement. Then that 95 doesn't sound so good anymore. Suppose that 5% was, 200 million people across the globe will die from COVID.
Ooh.
Now, again, I'm not saying these things are good or bad. What I'm trying to say is you can't just use that 95 to determine if it's good. You have to look at the cost of when it's not 95. Cost not being dollars, but cost of the impact, the use of it. And then what we do is we monitor these concepts. And then if we need to take action, we take action. We either take the model offline, we calibrate it. And we also do what's called a root cause analysis, try to determine what is driving that behavior. Some cases, it could be data. It could be assumptions have changed. It could be policies. Policies actually don't change as frequent as you would imagine. And even when policies do change, there has to be a sort of a acclimation period to that new policy.
Yeah. Okay, this has been great. So thank you. We had some good questions, a good discussion. So I think I want to take this opportunity because I know we're at time. And so I want to take this opportunity, Donald. I think I was going to say I have 30 seconds. I am now on negative time, but that's okay. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you so much for a very enlightening and engaging discussion about your role with AI and also in the fintech space. I learned a great deal in terms of fintech, and I have some more questions that I'll probably send you because I wanted to ask a few more. And just want to say thank you to everyone who participated in the Commanded webinar. And thanks again, Donald. This was fantastic. So want to give a shout out. So thank you. And we look forward to future engagement. So if you wanted to have any parting words, let me leave that to you.
No, just want to thank you all again for inviting me to speak. It was a pleasure hearing the questions. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Valerie, and thank you so much for a great job moderating and jumping in with your own insights and thoughts. I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions on today's call. You don't need to be shy. Use this opportunity, please. If you want to reach out with some questions, Valerie and I will try to get them answered. If you want to ping me on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. And then, thank you again, and thank you again to Command It for having me.
Our pleasure, and we'll share the data science document as well. So thanks, everyone, and we hope you have a great day or a great evening. Thanks.
Take care.